Welcome. So glad everyone is here. Well, we have reached high noon, at least here in Eastern Standard Time. There in California, as Monica was pointing out. And Amy, I believe you're behind, an hour behind us. But we'll go ahead and get started. First, just let me say a very warm welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Eric Smith, the Executive Director for Great Lakes Urban, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. As you know, Great Lakes Urban strengthens neighborhoods in the cities of Holland and Wyoming and several other communities in West Michigan. Our Lunch and Learns are designed to share stories and insights and inspiration about the power of community strengthening through asset-based community development. You can find our previous recordings of our previous Lunch and Learn, which focused on the local, kind of the hyper-local story of Holland, Michigan, on our website under the updates page. So go to greatlakеsurban.org and look up the updates page and you can find us there. But Great Lakes Urban also is about trying to catalyze a national movement around this work. And infuse into that what we've learned in doing this work since 2008 in West Michigan. So to help catalyze this and to catalyze this sort of movement, a pandemic, if you will, of connectedness, of belonging, of collective self-efficacy that sparks change in the places where we live, work, and play. And so what we've done is we've joined with 8 other founding organizations from across the country to launch a network for social transformation. What binds all of our organizations together is a deep commitment to a strengths-based or an asset-based lens, an approach, to a relationally driven approach, to a bottom-up and middle-out approach, to a revitalization in neighborhoods and communities, and to a kind of place-centric, place-centered focus. And today we are welcoming with us here 3 panelists who are luminaries, I would say. They're founders and directors of 3 of the organizations that make up the Network for Social Transformation, coming from Kaleidoscope Collaborative, Amy Moore's Consulting, and Lifeline CDC. And they'll be sharing from their strengths, from their background, and their significant and deep experience in generating just and lasting change. Now, before we get started, where we'll ask our panelists to we'll invite them to introduce themselves. I just want to say a couple of things. If you're new to Zoom, if you move your cursor, you will see some icons pop up at the bottom of your screen. And so I would welcome you, if you have questions or comments, if you have comments, use that chat icon, or you can also post questions in the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. We will take some time for discussion, about 30 minutes, 25, 30 minutes with me as moderator, with our panelists, but then we will turn things over toward the end. The last 15 minutes or so will be dedicated to answer any questions you might have over the course of our discussion. With that, I would like to invite our panelists to introduce themselves, tell us a little bit about who you are and your context, your organizational context, your geographic context, and the work that you're doing. Maybe we'll start with Amy, if that's okay, and then we'll move to Cheryl and Monica to wrap that up.
Happy to do it. This is the FedEx plane flies over. So I live in Memphis, Tennessee. And so right along the flight path of FedEx landing here was, if y'all don't know, FedEx is headquartered here in Memphis. But yes, so I am a social change consultant, and I have been consulting off and on since the mid-1990s with nonprofits, faith organizations, and local government. And also in that period of time, I have settled down for a while, and I've been executive director of 3 organizations, most recently a 10-year service to the Center for Transforming Communities. But my work and my passion really is to come alongside congregations, that's really where my heart is, who have a desire to connect or reconnect to the geography that surrounds their church building. So when they have a sense of we have some sort of responsibility to this community where we come every week to worship, I love to come alongside them and help mobilize them to mobilize the neighborhood to really act towards the dreams and vision that the community itself wants to see. So that's a little bit about me.
Wonderful, thank you. Cheryl?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Glad to be here. Cheryl Grosswright. I am operating out of Richmond, Virginia, where I am founder and CEO of Kaleidoscope Collaborative RVA. It's a consulting firm. And I am deeply involved in community engagement through Kaleidoscope, as well as diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice work, and personal development and coaching. My community engagement work is in close collaboration with Embrace Communities here in Richmond, which is an organization that's been working in neighborhoods and some of the toughest neighborhoods in Richmond since about 2005. And the Embrace Communities model really looks to go into communities and build strength from the inside out, really giving voice to neighbors, helping empower folks to dream their dreams, and then really have a mechanism to begin to make those dreams happen for themselves and for their community. And I've been really, really driven for this type of work since I ran a community center in the East End of Richmond called Greater Fulton, the Neighborhood Resource Center of Greater Fulton. And that community was really galvanized by a visioning process that led to about a 7-year process of engaging residents and really raising up leaders to make the kind of change in the community that they wanted to see. So I was very excited and proud to be really a part of seeing that kind of community change happen on the ground. So that's probably plenty from me as well.
Wonderful.
Thanks.
A delight to have
Thanks.
you.
Yeah,
Monica?
and so I'm Monica Gracely. I am in the Central Valley of California, the agricultural area. And we have a saying at Lifeline that your life story is not your life sentence, and your current location is not your destiny. And the story of your life is still being written, and you get to be part of writing it. So we believe strongly that every person has their own unique story, and we cannot just come in and assume that we know what's happening in somebody's life. And so for me, what that looked like, I grew up in Germany in a very dysfunctional home, graduated from 8th grade because the school determined I was too stupid to move forward. I was homeless for 3 years and ready to commit suicide when a guy shows up and says, God loves you. And that kind of introduced me to the Christian faith. But then years later, I ended up moving to the States and met a family that for the first time didn't look at my brokenness and the victim that I had become of some violent crimes, but looked at some gifts and abilities. And that changed the story of my life pretty much, right? And so fast forward, in 2007, I started a nonprofit organization called Lifeline CDC, and we're about empowering neighborhoods to thrive using a strength-based approach in the Central Valley, which is interestingly the breadbasket of the world, and yet more than 50% of our people live in poverty and do not have access to enough healthy fruits and vegetables. And so we are really using a strength-based approach to engage with community members and see them rediscover their own abilities and their own gifts and their own dreams, and then build on that strength to transform the neighborhood. So.
Yeah, thank you again. As with Cheryl and Amy, what a delight to have you join us. Thank you for sharing from your personal story and from the work, all of you. So there's a theme that I feel like I'm hearing. You know, it got expressed a little bit differently. You know, Amy talked about mobilizing congregations to mobilize the neighborhood where they have a footprint. You know, Cheryl, you talked about empowering those local leaders in the neighborhoods where you live. Monica, you talked about lifting up the gifts and pulling that out of people and starting there. So I feel like there's something fundamentally different to your sort of approach to the world. And I want to see if what I'm hearing is right. I feel like what I hear is your sense is people are the answer, and that community is the solution. Whereas I think a typical paradigm is that people are broken, have problems, as you experienced, Monica, with the way people viewed you, and that programs are the solution. And I wondered if you could play off of that. And do you feel like I'm hearing the right theme?
Yeah, I think so, because you see what you look for, right? So if you're an organization that has resources, you look for the problems that are there so you can invest into those resources into it. But if you come from a strength-based approach, I think it changes the way that we look at things, because then we don't start out with the resources that are needed. We start out with what's already present in the community.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would, Cheryl, were you going to say more?
I just, yeah, I mean, that's it. There's this assumption that people are broken, and the strength-based approach really goes in and says, what's already here that's positive, that's that we can help you build on. It's not about bringing a program in to fix people, but to help them be a part of whatever solutions they begin to raise up themselves based on the assets that are already there.
And I was going to add, Eric, that I love that quote. I believe Margaret Wheatley said, whatever the problem, community is the answer.
That's right.
I love to repeat that. And I have a really, I think it'll be a small little story from my own life, but I imagine that everybody's had an experience like this, particularly with the pandemic. At least I hope that you do. You have a story like this. But my daughter got married this past April. You all remember this past, not this past April, April 2020, a year ago. And we ended up having to scrap the big plans, and everything happened in our home and in our nearby park. And I just put out a call to my neighbors, the people on my street, to say, can you help me with flowers, with candles, with linens, with things to try to transform my home into something that got sort of close to a wedding that she had envisioned. And it was amazing what the abundance. I had more stuff than I could use. And I mean, and to me, it just proved to me once again, whatever the problem, community is the solution. And it was a fantastic experience. But it seems to me the pandemic, I hope, for many of us has opened up, because we have had to live more hyper local and more connected to the places and the people right in our vicinity.
Yeah.
Yeah, great story. I appreciate that. And I want to come back to Monica, if we could, with you for a second. It seems like what I'm hearing is the beginning of this different approach is the lens, the strengths lens that we bring to this, the asset-based lens that we bring to this work. And you experienced it very personally. What changed your trajectory was when somebody said you got something special to work, work in that space. And then how beautiful that you have turned around and you're doing the same thing now for multiple people in the communities that you serve in your region. And so I just wanted to open up some time, if you and others can join in if you like, but if you would be willing to share a story from something that you've served, how have you seen those gifts being pulled out and make a difference in the world?
Wow. In relationship and in conversations, right? And giving people opportunities, because when we start out, I think especially if you have grown up in dysfunction and poverty, where you have been told that you're no good, we come out initially as these broken people, but then as we get to know people and we find out their gifts and their abilities, it just opens up a brand new world to them and to us as well, right? So all of our staff has come through the Welfare to Work program in California where we work. And so one of the stories is a single mom who was homeless, living in a hotel, 2 kids by herself, and she just needed to get to start again. And so when she started with us, she would actually still live in the hotel, take her kids on a public transportation to school, drop off both of the kids, then come to work, and then reverse the whole thing. And that is 3 years ago. And so now we just had a conversation with a realtor because she's looking into purchasing a home. And so just that story, right? There's many, many steps in between, but she also has become our greatest advocate. So when somebody comes to our community center and says, you know, I have nothing, I'm on the street, I don't know what to do, and Marcy can say, been there, done that. I have walked that road, let's walk the next step together, right? Because we oftentimes talk about that when you live in poverty or when you live in any kind of society, you live in a bubble and all you know is all you know, right? And so one of my staff members at one time said, pop my bubble a little bit, right? Because they needed outside resources to kind of get out of the situation they were in. And so by giving them those resources, so we have community centers that are specifically there to provide resources to the community members on what they need and how they want to move forward, right? So they set the agenda of, this is what we need, this is what would help us. But then they also bring their own gifts to the table. So Marcy's gift is she's an amazing, amazing community connector. And she knows where the resources are and she walks with people and she helps them to move forward now, right? So her sons, as a single mom, it's always difficult to raise boys, especially if they're boys of color, into a safe, strong, young adults, right? So one of my board members is an African-American former military Air Force colonel who came alongside the boys and so just has conversations with the boys about some very interesting topics that I don't even know how to approach them, right? But they can talk about it. And that is really building on the gifts that Marcy already has, raising the boys, and now somebody else is coming alongside. We connect with outside resources. And so our summer programs are really a lot of activities for our kids. And so one of my friends is in a club that has experimental aircrafts. I don't know why they call them experimental because they fly. They're just smaller airplanes. Hopefully they're not experiments, but they said, we want to take our kids up and fly over Yosemite, right? But we're always saying, our kids don't get anything for free. And so they are going to have to study aerodynamics and build their own gliders that fly before they get to go on an airplane for the first time in their lives, right? So I love how when somebody gets a hold of the gifts and the abilities that they have, then they want to share it and they want to discover other people's gifts and abilities as well, right? I can talk forever. I'm going to stop now for now.
Wonderful story. It just reinforces that everybody, even our youth, have something to give, regardless of
Absolutely.
circumstances. And there isn't a sense that we can short circuit that self-pride and self-esteem if we're always working around that, and identifying people as being having problems and that being the identifier. Wonderful. Before I move on, Amy or Cheryl, do you want to speak to that idea of how we welcome people's assets and gifts into the world and to make a change? If not, I'll ask you, Amy. You know, I want to kind of go back to your kind of like introduction, and you clearly have a heart for congregations, and you've worked a lot in that space of churches and organizations. And all of our neighborhoods of our communities have institutions, have organizations, have churches. I wonder if you want to share, what is the gift that a church and a congregation, an organization is to the community, to a neighborhood story, and how that can be pulled out effectively so they're authentically partnering.
Yeah, with the the place that comes to mind for me to share in response to what you asked, Eric, it's called South Memphis. It's part of Memphis, but that's kind of what the community is called. And in this square mile of South Memphis, there are 30 congregations. So we often talk about in Memphis, there are 3,000 churches. And so one of my passions, at least for my hometown of Memphis, is, gosh, if we could just activate some of those churches to care for the community. And so I was really fortunate to meet one of those churches, a really small church, a really community connected pastor named Marlon Foster, who really, he already had the vision for how we release the strengths of the community. He just hadn't had the language or maybe some experience, didn't know there was tools, didn't know there was a whole movement and connection of us. And so he began to connect with the other pastors in the community, not all 30 churches, but we celebrated that 5 of those congregations came together and really came together with this vision that we are the church without walls. So before I met these churches, I would think of a single church, kind of opening its walls. That's the church without walls. But they saw themselves collectively, these 5 churches of the different denominations, as the church without walls, that they were permeable. They weren't worried about losing members or anything of that nature. They were worried about how do we mobilize what resources we have to do more for this place that God has given us. And so those 5 congregations still did their own programming. So one of them might have already been hosting an annual health fair. And so instead of another congregation starting a health fair, let's all support that congregation in the health fair. Another one started a community block festival. All of them said, we want to help make this the best community block festival we can be. One of them took just a vacant lot across from the church and began building a community garden, which is quite a common thing. All of the churches were like, how can we support that? And it's now not just a community garden, it's an urban farm. It takes up a whole city block in Memphis with agriculture and teaching the children and feeding the community. But that, to me, that's one of my favorite stories, is those 5 congregations. And it would have been great to have all 30, but wow, did we celebrate that 5 would come together and work for the good of the community and sort of let go of their own agendas, their own fears, and really trust that God was with them as they journeyed together on that work.
Inspiring. And who knows, the story's just starting, right? This the arc of the universe is long, as Martin Luther King would say. So the other churches might be attracted to that in time, right? Cheryl, I'd love to come back to you. There's something unique with Embrace Richmond and to your work in that story. Both, there's that very much the neighborhood focus that you've had. There's also, in addition to that, I know in more recent years, you've also seen it play out in terms of sectors. You've seen this sort of approach used by schools. You've seen this approach used by the local health department. So anyways, you have a lot of just amazing stories, and you share a little bit about, residents coming up and meeting the challenge and making change. I just want to give you some space and to ask, how does deep change happen? How does this leadership get cultivated at the grassroots level?
Yeah, great question. And I'm going to go to one comment that was in the chat about how do you encourage a neighborhood to dream together? And that is something that Embrace has done really from its beginning, and that is to really figure out how to listen, to go into a community and actually literally do an on-the-ground listening project where you talk to folks, you interview people across the community and really figure out what are their dreams. If they had the ability to make a change and they knew they wouldn't fail, what would it be? So we listened to folks, and that's what took us to the whole education piece. Wendy McCagg, who's the executive director of Embrace Communities, once had a student ask her in a training about neighborhood work. He asked her, Miss Wendy, is a school a community? Is a school a neighborhood? And she said, well, yeah, I think it is. She said, well, because my school is more scary to me than my neighborhood. And it was like, whoa. And that's obviously a young person who's not only noticed the neighborhood that he lives in and how safe or not unsafe he felt there, but the fact that his school felt even more unsafe. So Wendy being Wendy, she began to really envision a way in which to take Embrace Communities and the work we've been doing in neighborhoods and really extrapolate that and figure out how to encourage that same kind of development in schools using school personnel, teachers. In our area, there's an organization called Communities in Schools, and they have coordinators in schools. So it was kind of a natural place to start, to have a person on the ground that really could listen and work with the students and begin to give them the opportunity to identify, so what's wrong with our school? And a recent example of a school that we're working in, school lunch was a big one for them. The teachers and the staff don't look like we look. And there was a group of students who were non-English speakers who were really separated out, segregated, and they felt that it was important to find ways to bring those students along to feel more a part of the school community. So their listening project led to several opportunities to begin to make those pieces happen. And then COVID happened. So some plans that were already in the works that these students were involved in to really begin to make some of those things happen got tremendously interrupted. But we've still been we still have relationships with those folks, and we're hoping that once we're back closer to being in person, that some of those efforts can really continue in some additional schools, because it's obvious that schools are neighborhoods that need this kind of resource building as well. And it's been really, really eye-opening to see just how naturally this kind of work does apply, because schools have assets, of course. And it's about going in and listening for us and finding out what those assets are, and then equipping those young people to begin to make the kind of change in their school that they want to see.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you. It's a subject that's close to my heart. I spent several years when I was a connector, bridging that life of schools and the life of the surrounding community.
Yeah.
I just want to make a quick note. In about, I'd say about 5 minutes, we'll be transitioning to taking additional questions, and I see there's a couple in the chat. But I just want to invite folks to be thinking about what questions has this conversation brought up in your mind. Drop those in the Q&A or the chat so that we can turn to those in about 5 minutes. I kind of want to play on Cheryl's comment here a little bit. So Monica, Cheryl talked about the student that said, well, my school community, my school neighborhood is a tough environment for me. And there might be some on this Lunch and Learn today. You might be wondering, look, I live in community X, Y, and Z with these issues. I'm not sure if this strengths-based approach, this bottom-up approach can work here. But I know that you work in a very diverse kind of environment, including some very tough, and so forth. So I would wonder if you would like to speak into that question that people might have.
Yeah, so Winton is one of the communities we live in, which is less than 8,000 people that live there. But it was known as a drug capital of the United States at one point, believe it or not, because it was just the way that the route works. And we just had a bust of $1 billion just recently. So lots and lots of difficult issues, but also lots and lots of people who really care. So my very first community connector, one of my first community connector, was a former gangster who ended up having 2 strikes against him, and he was a dad at that, well, he was a dad of 5 at that point, and pregnant, his wife was pregnant with the 6th one. And he said, I'm done. And he went on the Welfare to Work program and started working with us. So he went from probably $20,000 income a month to $800 income a month, right? And the temptation, of course, was always there. And we had some amazing conversation, but he also was a community connector, right? So here's a gangster who has a really tough history. Actually, we were driving through a storage unit, and he said, hey, are there any cold storage units here? And I'm like, yeah, they have refrigeration. And he said, you could bury a lot of bodies here. I'm like, okay, that was more information than I wanted to know, right? But he was also the connector that started our first community gardens, because he knew how to garden because he was Latino background and his parents had taught him. He was the one that could connect with our at-risk youth because he had been there, done that, and could help them move forward. Was it easy? Absolutely not, right? But he now, because he was an AmeriCorps member and Jay was very instrumental in that, he became a chef. He went to school through a scholarship, became a chef, and now works in some restaurants. And so every person, no matter what their background is, has a story, right? And you go and walk the neighborhood and you find the people that are these connecting pieces, these connectors that are there, right? And then amazing things happen. So we've been partnering with the church for a number of years now. And my initial conversations with this church in Winton was, if this is about church growth, I'm not going to be part of this. It has to be kingdom growth. It has to be about how do we expand God's presence in our community. And so over the years, we have used their facility for kids' activities. And a couple of weeks ago, we worked on a garden out there. And the pastor came up and he said, I don't think I told you this, but we're in the process of rekeying one of the big rooms that we have and getting it onto a separate emergency system, whatever that thing is called, alarm system. And we want to hand you the key so that you can use this room for whatever you want to use it for. No strings attached, right? And this is a upper middle class, mostly white church that's now opening their doors to a primarily under-resourced yet gifted community of Winton, right? So it takes years, so don't go in and think that in 2 years you can fix the problems of this world. We have been in Winton for 15 years and we're seeing the shift happening, right? But it takes a long time. So, oh my goodness, yes, do it. But start out with just walking the neighborhood and praying for the neighbors that you see. Don't come up with your own ideas. Don't do anything that you think would work. Just walk the neighborhood, pray, and let God open up the doors. And then there's a great process around that. So, done.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing those stories and the practical advice, right? Yeah, walk the neighborhoods. Cheryl, looks like you were going to add something.
I would echo the need to appreciate the time that it takes. This is not, you are not going to go into a neighborhood and make a significant change in a year. You'll be lucky if 2 years brings you into, closer space with a handful of residents. 3 years, yes, you probably could begin to hope and expect that you'll be building a really core group of those builders, community builders, people who really are about building up, about empowering, about making change, and facilitating that process. So they then become a part of really encouraging and bringing other people to the table and sharing their gifts and helping others share theirs as well. The relationship building, the trust has got to be built over time. No organization, no nonprofit, no program should expect to go into a community and immediately hit the ground with anything that is going to work, because it takes that building that trust and relationship in order to figure out what comes next, what's possible based on what's already here. I can't echo that enough, but the time is, it's a horizon. It's not an easy fix. It takes time, and you have to be willing to invest that time and energy, and social capital that develops over time. Yeah.
Can I just piggyback on that with Cheryl just for a second? I could write a book on all the stuff I screwed up. Can I just say that? I have like story after story where I came in with good ideas, or I wanted to have an initiative. But the reality is we're going to make mistakes. You're going to make mistakes. And that's just part of the growing process, right? And if you have relationships, then they will forgive you, and you have to put on your big person's pants, whatever that phrase is, and move forward, right? So yeah,
Absolutely.
it's a long story. Yep.
Before we move into answering some questions that have come in, I want to turn to Amy. I just wonder, what is this conversation so far? What's been opening up for you to wrap up this piece of the moderated conversation?
Well, I guess we'll just lingering here in the how long it takes. I know as I work alongside communities and churches, and I usually get to work along somebody who's going to be a catalyst for. So it's the church trying to catalyze the neighborhood, or the local government trying to catalyze. And this idea I have to really, really, really hammer home. You've got to just stop and listen. And so I said, it may not be long enough, Cheryl and Monica, but I say, I need you at least 3 months. We are not making any decisions, at least give me 3 months. And then, as you said, Monica, we use probably a very similar process to you guys in coaching them to just listen. Listen to the neighbors, listen to God, but just listen. And so the way that I now communicate this with my churches is discover, begin to connect some of the, both in your mind and maybe connecting some people you've met, and then act. So discover, connect, act. And to get to that action, I'm going to at least ask them to, we're talking 6 months, 9 months, a year before we pilot something. I'm not making any great big strategic plans, because you are going to constantly be learning, and everything that you do, your eyes just open up to new possibilities, to new assets, to new gifts, so that something like a strategic plan, at least from my perspective, doesn't always work for this work, because it is so emergent, and it is the more you see, and you almost have so many opportunities. It's amazing.
Wow, what a great way to move into the questions, right? The more you see, the more you see. I love that. So we do have several chats, questions coming in. We'll turn to those. I do want to note that, if we don't get to everything, we will be following up in the next 24 hours or so, and we'll try to suggest some ways to get involved in your community and make a difference. Some ways that I may try to answer some of those questions you may have that don't get answered here. Cheryl, I wonder if you could kick us off for this portion of our Lunch and Learn. Because you mentioned program in one of your comments. And so Jay asked this, he says, community, you say, is the answer. Most nonprofits would say they are part of the community. When do programs slip from doing good to doing harm? So could you kick us off, Cheryl, and then anybody else could jump into that question as well.
Yeah, that's a tough one to answer, because I think what a lot of organizations don't realize is that if you're going in with the intention of fixing something, you're already doing harm. And I know that sounds harsh, and I don't mean to be. What that means is that there's this whole thing about providing relief and going in and doing what you think is needed. And that can be a good thing. But what that also can do is force a dependence on organizations and services that really strips away a lot of the dignity that folks can achieve by doing for themselves. I love how often Amy said walking alongside, because that's really what it takes for organizations to be successful in working this way, is to go in with the intention of walking alongside people and helping them, but not doing for them. Doing with is very much how I think organizations can begin to move away from that idea of harm and really helping. But it's helping alongside and doing with, not doing for.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. Do with, not to or for.
Exactly.
Monica or Amy, anything to add to that, or should we go to the next question?
No, I was just going, as you were talking, Cheryl, I was just thinking, yes, and wow, sometimes it's hard.
It is hard.
So when I was the director of a nonprofit, there's always the pressure to raise money. There's always the pressure to deliver on outcomes that your funder is looking for. And it can be very challenging to hold that demand on you while also wanting to be open to doing, just following the community, just doing with, not trying to control the outcome so that I can raise the money to support the organization. So while yes, and yes, Cheryl, I also just wanted to put out there that it also can be a challenge. It can, it is. And I don't think it's so much because of who we are as individuals. I really do think it's kind of the way our whole philanthropy is set up. It's the way the systems that we even have to operate in can sometimes cause us to act counter to what we wanted to do, because you're trying to navigate all of that. So just putting that out there as a real thing.
Yeah. When at the same time, I think we're also saying that we're not against bringing in outside resources, if that's what the community needs and wants, right? So let them be the one that sets the agenda around it. So like for us, one of the issues was, believe it or not, we're in the Central Valley, but food security was a big issue for us. There was no access for fresh fruits and vegetables for many of our families because there were no grocery stores close by. And so that took time to kind of get out of community members. But then we were able to partner with the health department, who then gave us grants for community gardens. And so this morning I got this text from one of my staff members that says, hey, just want to let you know, so-and-so just donated 15 chili peppers that she grew from seed that goes into our community garden, because they know that that's what our community wants, right? So I think bringing in outside resources at the right time is a good thing, because we don't have all the expertise, right? And I'm always saying, don't duplicate what somebody else is doing well. So if our families are saying, hey, we need some classes around diabetes, I don't want to be the expert. I don't want to learn that. I'll bring in outside resources to do that, right? So I think the partnership needs to be, it needs to be community members being at the center of what they want to see happening, but then bring in the resources to enhance the community at a level that they feel would be helpful to them, right? And it also, I think we get an opportunity to teach other nonprofits and government agencies on what a different mindset, what an ABCD lens looks like, and how it could be so much better for the community when this partnership becomes a real partnership.
Yeah, I see where Jay seems to be following up on this and says, do you concur that when a participant becomes a recipient, that's where you cross the line? Does that seem to be the what makes the difference?
Well, I'm not sure, because sometimes I'm a recipient as well, right? I mean, when somebody takes a class on, for example, diabetes prevention, because they just needed to get some help, they are a recipient of the knowledge, but they were the one that asked for it, if that makes sense. So on the whole, I think I like that picture of not becoming a recipient, but at times we all are recipients of some kind of resource or whatever it is.
It sounds like maybe keeping, if the person is at the center and the neighborhood is at the center and setting the agenda, that
Yeah.
maybe that's what you're saying is
Yeah.
the key.
Yeah.
Let's see. Someone else asked, is it, we live in a world where people want more immediate results. So how do you get others on board with a lengthier and healthier process that's being described here?
You know, I'll jump in with just what I tend to do is my experience has been is that there will be some, you know, let's say if you've got a group of 10 people that you've convened that you want to engage in a lengthier process, there will be some that can do that and can sit with that sort of open-endedness of the process for a while. And there will be some that cannot. And I actually find for me that it is helpful to invite them to step aside, to wait, you know, 6 months when we've done this work, and we'll have these more actionable things that person can engage in. But I recently facilitated a group in McAllen, Texas, down at the border. And we had just that. We had some that were willing to go out and do the community listening and could sort of sit in that space of just being open-minded and being curious. And then we had a few that were, we've got to be putting a plan together. We've got to set goals. We've got to do this and we've got to do that. And it is sort of almost an art to get them to sort of step, you know, just, okay, we are going to get there. And so, like I said, I often don't hesitate to say, you know, it would really be okay if you want to just, we'll call you in 6 months when we're ready.
And I would also wonder if some of those folks that, you know, want the immediate answers, part of the process might be to see if they're willing to actually be a part of that listening, and, you know, taking that piece, being a part of that piece. I think by being out there and hearing and part of the listening, that begins to give them a whole different sense of what the emergent needs are. What are the immediate things that need to happen? And I would hope perhaps that might change their need for that immediate, outcome to be what they're actually hearing themselves, is the actual immediate need, not what we might think it is, but what we're hearing it is, and make them a part of that process. But I know those folks they're tough. They know what they want, and that's why I'm here, and give me something to do. And hopefully as the process happens, you can make those small tasks that some of those folks can do along the way, and that might help engage them earlier on, so that they can then commit for the longer term. Just a thought.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you for sharing. Monica and I were talking the other day and talked about this book title that says, "Whose reality counts?" Right?
Mm.
Your idea of listening and identifying the needs right from the ground up is one way of honoring the fact that their reality is what matters the most, and then building the work around that.
Yeah.
So we had another question, and it goes like this. I appreciate this approach and the idea of walking the neighborhood, of praying. They probably also say of listening. What does that look like when you're just getting started?
Just like that. I literally usually have one community member that lives in the community just walk with me, share stories about the neighborhood. We pray together if it's a person of faith. We just walk, we observe, we see what's happening. We observe the cultural changes and differences that might be there, right? So you can go from one community to the next, and one community has sofas outside and do community outside, and the other one has like, oh my goodness, no, absolutely not. That's like so hillbilly, or whatever the phrase is, right? So ghetto, I guess my people would say. And it's just that we need to recognize that there's this strength in just observing what is already happening there. Find out the history, right? I mean, it's not like we're walking in there and going, hey, God just moved into the neighborhood. Isn't this good, right? Because God already moved in the neighborhood. In John 3:16, God became flesh and dwelt among us. He moved into the neighborhood long before we ever showed up. And so how do we just get to partner with him? And that means we listen to his spirit, but then we also just walk. And you can take weeks of just walking, and don't ever do it in a big group, right? Because especially if you're in a totally different environment, you don't want to stick out like a sore thumb. And, I was working at one point with a small community, a very under-resourced neighborhood. And as we were walking, the community members pretty much says, stop researching us. You come in here, you're asking us the questions, you tell us how poor we are, and then you get the grant and do whatever you want to do with it, and never get to do anything in the neighborhood, right? So we don't want to do that. We want to partner with the community members. So I'm sorry, I'm stopped. An hour is not long enough to talk about this.
Especially with the three of you and your deep experience, and just the presence and who you are and your approach to things. I'd like to kind of wrap things up as our time is swiftly coming to a close, as Monica pointed out, with just kind of a speed round. We've gone through a very difficult year, and if each of you want to take a final minute and share something that's on your heart of how you feel folks in this community we have here with us today, and those of you listening in the future, how they might be able to get involved in this movement, in this sort of pandemic of connectedness that we're trying to build. So I'll just open up that space. Amy, would you like to kick us off the speed round?
Oh my. I guess what I was going to say, Eric, when you started the question, and because my mind already went there, and then I'm not sure if this is exactly what you were asking, but I think that there's still time and space to be hosts of bringing community together. So I personally, thinking about pandemic, and I have a little bit of anxiety that we will just go back to where we were, that the rubber band is going to pop back. And one of the things I'm doing with my own church, which is also in the neighborhood where I live, this Friday, in fact, we're hosting a community event to just come out on the lawn and have a little bit of activity stations in sort of a reflective moment, so just to invite the neighborhood to come out. Not so much, it isn't going to be so much social and barbecue and balloons, but it's just to try to hold a little bit of space for remembering the year and thinking about how we want to move forward. So I don't know, that's just kind of what's on my heart, is how to, and I think all of us can figure out ways to host communal space that tries to honor some of the things that we hope we learned from the pandemic.
Thank you. Monica, any thoughts?
Yeah, I can piggyback on that. When I think about the pandemic and the response of our communities that live in poverty and always live under stress and always live under uncertainty, they are the ones that said, this is not a big deal. We live like this all the time, right? So I think for my middle class friends, the reminder is that what you just experienced over the last year and the chaos that it caused you in your personal life, in your emotions, in your stress level, that is what my communities that live in poverty always experience. Because everything is uncertain. Nobody knows in poverty what the next step is. Nobody knows if the schools are going or if there's going to be some assistance available, what the transportation looks like, what the health looks like. Our communities in living in poverty don't have any security in any of this. And we as middle class folks have taken all of this for granted. We have rhythms in life. And the pandemic disrupted all of our rhythms of life. And so the stress that we experienced is something that our communities in poverty experience all the time. And so just a reminder for that, and kind of learning from that experience and recognizing why sometimes people respond differently than we want them to respond to things. So.
Well, and I have about a minute now, I think, but that's okay. I think what I really, and we didn't even get to anything about social justice and differences that, is certainly a part of this work as well. What I think I am longing for and am drawn to this work is the real opportunity to see people, to really see someone, to sit down, a cup of coffee, or as you're at your doorway and we're connecting about something, or a community meeting, whatever it might be, and really listen, really have an exchange, really see that person and have them see me. That for me is what's so important and gives me so much hope about building community this way. It's really seeing other people. I think we've gotten so far away from that ability, and it really isn't complicated. That's pretty simple. Let me see you and you see me. So that's what I'll offer.
Thank you for that. I want to echo and just to really appreciate something Jay said in the chat here. He said, Monica, Amy, Cheryl, thank you! Exclamation point. I'm so grateful for you.
It's been my pleasure.
Enough to share with us. Amen. Amen to your comments. Hosting is so critical. I want to wrap up with just very briefly, going back to something Amy said. She pointed out that there's a stress in the nonprofit world to fundraise, and sometimes the way that happens is it leads to the opposite of what we might want to do. And so I just want to say a word of thanks to those of you around this table, figurative table. Many of you I know are supporting the work of GLU and Great Lakes Urban. And so I want to appreciate that. And if you have not, if this has pulled in your heartstrings, and you want to contribute, you can go to greatlakеsurban.org and click on the donate us page, and that'll take you through a process, a secure process to do that. But what we really need is more and more folks that understand there's a different way of doing this, a different way of looking at the world, a different way of creating just and lasting and sustainable change and transformation in hearts and minds and communities and neighborhoods. And so I just want to say again, thanks to all that have contributed time, talent, treasure to this growing movement across the country. And again, a special thanks to Cheryl, Monica, and Amy for being with us and for giving of your time. Your gifts are appreciated. We just are grateful.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, yes. So we'll go ahead and wrap up our Lunch and Learn. Thank you again to all that participated. And we'll be back in 3 months' time with another panel just to continue to explore and be inspired on the work of connecting neighborhoods and communities. Thank you, everyone. And
Thank you.
next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much.